So taking a look at the glass module here, hopefully the lesson learned is essentially that glass is not described on its edges by using pure white. In fact, if you did find yourself using a lot of white for the edges, you probably were forced to make everything darker than necessary, which is what I actually see here. So if you recall, white is our brightest value. That's going to be our highlight. And we need it to actually pop out or really stand out from other colors and values when we apply it. If your values are not dark enough on the object, then essentially your highlights won't stand out. If you use white to describe the edges of your object, then you really can't tell the difference between a highlight and the edges. So you can see here we actually see some very intense marks here with your brightest value all over the edges. And so you can't really tell, even though it looks nice, you can't really tell what's a highlight and what isn't. And so we definitely want to make some adjustments so that we can tell where light is striking the object directly and where the most brilliant highlights do appear. We also need to make adjustments to the background and the foreground as well, because I think from what I'm observing here, you essentially made everything much darker than it needed to be because of the fact that you were working with such an intense range of colors for the actual glass itself. So first off, the lesson to learn here is that glass essentially is two complements mixed together to describe its edges. When we look at this photograph here, essentially the objects around it are the colors that we typically see in the edges. The foreground and background are going to be the colors that actually are used to describe the edges and the large surfaces. So notice here what we're seeing is this foreground color is the base, and then the hazy kind of effect here on top is this foreground color added on top of it. And the actual edges all in here, and again, ignore all of the reds and the yellows and all of that craziness. Avoid or ignore all of the extra details, even the highlights, and just break it down as to what exactly you're seeing. You're seeing the background through glass. The background is going to be the color that you're going to use to describe all of the edges and surfaces here. It's essentially, when we're looking at this, and we'll go through it again a little bit more, but the edges are a complement mix, gray. And if we make a grayer, darker version of a color and then we layer highlights on top, the highlights will pop out, which is exactly what we're going for. Typically, in many instances, we actually see that it's a orange and blue mix. Here we have cadmium yellow and terra rosa. When you mix the two together, that's orange and blue. You add small amounts of blue into it at a time to make it gradually darker and darker. The highlights are cadmium white and yellow, or cadmium yellow and white, sorry, and then details are essentially the background color that we see here, which is actually more of a green. It leans a little bit more greenish, and typically when we see yellow light on top of a black surface, it does read as a relative green color. And you can add a little bit of red into that, and that'll create a complement mix for the interior of the glass and dull out that value a little bit more as well. And the color of the bottle, that's what we're seeing in the inside here, is those two factors. The base again is the foreground color here, and a little bit of orange, which you can add its complement, blue and orange, to create that kind of haziness here. Or you can just take some of this complement mix, which is a gray, and you're just basically adding gray to that blue to create that effect. So we'll come back to this in just a moment, but I wanted to point out a couple of things as to why this can be more effective by approaching this in terms of complements as opposed to just making all of the edges extremely intense. We want that lost and found effect. With this type of approach here, with everything being illuminated at this rate, we typically see that it's completely outlined. And it may have kind of an odd two-dimensional look to it as a result. So when we're looking at this, let's talk about value. So if I actually made some of the adjustments that I'm talking about, and I changed the background even, you can see here it still reads quite effectively as glass. I've made the background a little bit, it's dark here and then gradually lighter as it goes up. So we can see that here, it's light striking right here and it's dark as it's going down in each direction. And I've adjusted it to where it's light on this side and gradually darker as you go across. I typically just cover this glass portion here, but I wanted to point out a couple of other things here too on your painting to make it even more spectacular or stronger. Notice how your objects are being lost into this background. We don't want that to happen. So what I want you to pay close attention to is, do you see how I've subtly made a slight change here in the background color? And I made it just a little bit lighter, just so that I can see the dark edges of that actual bottle come right back into play. I've also made an adjustment to the actual cast shadow. If you remember, cast shadows are dark here and then gradually become lighter and lighter as they travel away. That doesn't mean that they're going to be extremely light, but it is lighter when you compare it to the background. So this background is just a little bit lighter than the bottle, but still darker than the cast shadow here. Both of them need to be lightened up a little bit so you can see the bottom edges of the bottle and the side edges of this apple here. The apple, again, needs to be lighter on this side right here. And it's essentially an alizarin and blue mixture that we're typically seeing on this side of the apple. Again, alizarin being our cooler red. And then this whole area needs to be a little bit brighter, right? Because we really want that edge of the cast shadow to pop out, and we really need it to read very strongly. And so in order to do that, we need to lighten up the foreground a little bit more so that it clearly reads separate from the actual cast shadow shapes. So those are some adjustments that I would make to these other areas as well to make this painting really stand out and be far, far more successful. So let's just focus on the glass again. Here I've made the edges and I'm paying attention to the pattern. There's typically two patterns that we see in many instances in glass. It's either going to be darker in the middle and then gradually lighter as you work your way to the sides. So the sides are light and then the middle is darker, or it's the opposite. It's lighter in the middle and darker on the edges. So in this case, all we need to do when we're looking at clear glass is look at the edge and compare it to the background. The background is darker, the edge is lighter. So we know it's going to be that one pattern that I just mentioned. Light on the edges, darker in the middle. Typically, it's always going to be clearer, sharper in the middle. So if there's something directly behind it, we're typically going to see a very clear, dark version of value. It's not going to be dim, it's not going to be tinted or anything. You can see that very clearly here. Because even though it's rounded glass, that one point directly in front of us is like looking through two perfect panes of glass, like two windows, back to back. And there's no distortion. But as you move away from the center, you'll notice it starts to distort because light is actually reflecting and it's essentially bouncing around there, creating all kinds of distortion and essentially some kind of haziness, which is complementary mixes on their edges. Again, all of these hazy grays that we're seeing are complementary mixes, darker grays. And so when we actually put our highlight value on top of them, we're really going to see a difference in terms of the value. We're going to see that there's a real contrast and they're going to stand apart from one another. So we can see here that if we made those adjustments, it would make this even far more successful. I would definitely pay attention to the ellipse as well. And in terms of ellipses, you may have noticed that there was kind of a little blurb on how to create an ellipse in there. Again, the formula I'm going to show you here, this one's if we're looking kind of at eye level. It will vary, though, based on your perspective. So if you're looking extremely above or below an object, then the perspectives will be different on the ellipse in the base in comparison to the ellipse in the mouth. They'll be slightly different from one another. We can see that here in yours, right? Because we're looking from below on this case, not eye level. And so we can see here it's a much larger ellipse here, and then this one's in a different perspective. It's much smaller. So try to stay eye level for as long as you can. Typically looking slightly down, just a little bit above objects is ideal. Here, this is the basic construction method if you're actually looking at eye level. It's a very easy way to really capture elliptical shapes quickly. And essentially I've just drawn a box for the shape of my glass, the size, and then I've taken a measurement of how wide I want the mouth to be. And then I've just taken that same measurement and applied it to the bottom. So it's the same from top to bottom. Then from there I divide it into 4 equal sections. Now for the base it's a little bit different because in my example I observed that the base is slightly smaller than the mouth. And again, you want to drop a line down vertically in your drawing to see where, and compare it to the glass in front of you, to compare where the base sits in relation to the mouth. Sometimes the base might be wider, which means that maybe you'll have to bring the mouth in a little bit further. When you do make that adjustment though, whatever adjustment you make to one side, you have to apply the exact same measurement on the opposite side, so we have symmetry. It's the same from one side in comparison to the other. From there I've created a series of dots for both ellipses in these boxes. I don't want to actually draw it directly because I may need to tweak it and make some changes visually. And usually creating a series of dots is a good way to determine if it's looking good before I actually commit to the actual line. And here I've actually connected the dots, and now I'm working my way down the shapes itself. Again, I want to maintain that idea of symmetry, and I'm not going to draw directly the roundness of the object. That's a good way to actually be out of proportion and to be kind of out of symmetry, because trying to capture that same edge, maybe you're right-handed and you're better at making the gesture on the right side and not so great on the left. So in order to avoid that type of issue, essentially I'm just observing how far down the glass the bend occurs. So you can see here this is where the bend occurs in the glass. So I've actually drew a little line across just as a guide. And then I'm essentially drawing everything in straight lines. Every time a bend or change in direction occurs, I'm just drawing a line across to where I've observed that it's occurring, and then I'm using straight lines to connect one side and the other. And I'm making sure that the shape looks the same as I'm working my way all the way through. Everything's in straight lines at this point. Then I can go back and round off edges and round off shapes. This is the best approach to make sure that everything is symmetrical and that everything is essentially aligning. So here with the straight line method, I can see here the change in direction is going to happen on this line, and it's going to be the same as it is on this side here. So I'm not going to have any issues in terms of trying to capture that rounded shape on one side in comparison to the other. So we already looked at this in terms of value. So we know what kind of adjustments need to be made if we wanted to decide to take it a different direction. If you decide to keep it the way that it is, I would definitely adjust the base a little bit and bring in some of this lighter value here into the base so it's not completely pitch black in there. And then I would also make those adjustments to these areas as well that I had mentioned, just so that we don't lose the shapes of our objects into the background. But for the most part, I'd like to see more grayer edges so that a lot of these highlighted areas really stand out a lot more brilliantly. So you can see here when we're looking at this and I apply this process here, I'll adjust this again, is that essentially it's reading a little bit stronger and it's a little bit more colorful as well. So I've taken this and I've created different versions of the blue. So I have light, medium blue, and dark blue. And of course it's really making that cast shadow stand out. I've adjusted the cast shadow so that it's lighter than what we're seeing here for the bottle, so I can see some of the subtlety of the edges of the bottle. And I've adjusted the background a little bit as well so that I can still see the edges of the bottle from the back view. Notice that, again, the comparison. The cast shadow is darker, the background is a little bit lighter. So this is that relationship. Here, again, I've made some adjustments. I've grayed out all of these edges using the formulas that I've talked about. these formulas here. I'm letting some of this of the bottle come through and bleed through some of the darks and some of the actual greens here. And I've made some adjustments as well on the apple. So I brought back some of this shape of the apple using more of my cooler reds. And of course this is blue because it's on the shadow side, so I mixed those together. And I just wanted to point out that there's reds and oranges on this side, on the light side of the actual apple. So you got to be careful, and I'd paint this as a red apple first and then apply some orange into that, or yellow into that mix to add some accents on top. That would be the best approach for that. And then lastly, I just want to point out this this top bottleneck portion. So this essentially is going to lean toward gold, right? Yellow with red in it. It's a yellow-orange. And so I'm using a duller one here, and that's going to fill in this side here. The dark side, what's the opposite of orange? Blue, right? So I'm going to add blue to that mix, and that's what's going to create this effect. And then I can actually come back with a much more brilliant, straight, just cadmium yellow, not highlight yet, just cadmium yellow, and put that in the middle. So now I have a duller mix, cadmium yellow, complementary mix, and then highlight on top. Highlight at the end, but it still should look like it's turning three-dimensionally even without the highlight. So you can see here I've used only 3 values and the highlight just on top, and it works very well in terms of adding dimension and also adding some kind of contrast to it. And as you can see with all of these adjustments, especially the complementary mixes in the glass, we do start to see that the highlights specifically are standing out on their own. And that essentially is the idea. Lost and found, using the background values to accentuate the edges and create the edges of the glass, and then using the objects behind it and letting some of that bleed through to create some nice interesting shapes. Complementary mixes is the key. And of course, you'll know if the values are correct when you actually apply your highlights and they stand out from your actual glass values. So here I'll post some of these formulas that I've indicated that you could use for the background, some of the things that I would guess myself to use. But again, experiment, because just because I said, hey, use cadmium yellow in this doesn't mean that you couldn't use ochre with that mix. I'm kind of giving you an overview of what it is that you could use when you're thinking about your process and where it is that you're placing some of these things. So, for example, the reflected light for this apple, it's this color right here. So I'm going to take some of this, mix it with my red, and apply that. It'll be a little bit duller, which is fine because that's exactly what we want, but it'll actually be a reflection of this surface into the actual apple. So you can see here, we need to think about the environment, what's influencing our objects, and essentially more about complementary mixes.